Right. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Heritage University. We've got notes that are coming around. So when Melissa gets a chance, they will make it around to you. But tonight we're going through the book of Judges, and I'd invite you to open up your Bible there. As we've gone through this, of course, we had spring break last week, and this is really kind of the sprint to the finish over the next several weeks as we're going through Old Testament survey. And I think it's always helpful to remind ourselves kind of where we've been, orient ourselves to what we already know, and help that to color what we're doing tonight. So we've been through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then last time we went through the book of Joshua. And really those first 6 books of the Bible all tell us the story of God's redemptive plan. Remember, Genesis is really the story of Abraham, of his faith, but even before Abraham, the way that God created the world, his intention and his design for the world. But as we build, remember, the Old Testament is really building a story, and it's pushing forward a narrative that's continuous. And the example that I use often is you think of like a television show. There are many different episodes in a given season, but then you have season 1, you have season 2, you have season 3, and it's all building a plot line that from beginning to end follows the same characters, the same people, and even though certain characters may come and go, it's all building to a particular conclusion. Well, the same thing is true in the Old Testament. Of course, the main character of the Old Testament that never changes is God. From the very beginning, before the beginning, he's there. For every single person and every single interaction, he's there. But as we see God, we see his character unfold in the Old Testament. Genesis shows us that it's faith that pleases God. You can't do anything to earn it. Exodus shows us that he wanted to build a people, a missionary nation, a kingdom of priests, Exodus 19, who would demonstrate his character to a world that had abandoned him and had forgotten him. Leviticus shows us the requirements of what it takes to live in proximity to a holy God. If God is going to live with his people, the people have to live in holiness so that God can live among them. Then we look at Numbers and we see that, wait a minute, even though there are these laws that you have to follow, it's not simply the fact that you follow the laws and you're automatically right with God. No, Numbers is a reminder that faith is a necessary prerequisite to the whole thing. So the people of Israel trying to go to the promised land, remember God's brought them out of Egypt to Mount Sinai. He's leading them to the promised land. They've got all these laws, but what God reminds them of is, hey, if you don't trust me enough to obey me, then you can follow laws all day long, but that isn't going to please me. Deuteronomy, again, we have more laws, but God puts following his laws in the context not just of faith, but also, and this is so important, of love. Remember, Deuteronomy 6 is the famous passage, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. And then throughout Deuteronomy, there's this emphasis again, love the Lord your God, love the Lord your God, love the Lord your God. Again, God isn't fooled by even the kind of obedience that we might say, oh, well, that person's faithful because they're obedient. God says it's not enough just to be obedient. You have to be obedient. Why? Because you love me. In other words, God isn't fooled by externals. And then as we get to Joshua, God continues working with this hard-hearted people, this stiff-necked people known as the Israelites. He takes them to the promised land and he tells them, listen, I've given this land to you. Why? So that you could have a place to live, so that you could live out your calling as a missionary nation. Go and take the land, at which point we see in the book of Joshua, they take some of the land, but ultimately, there is a lot of the land that they don't actually end up conquering. They basically subjugate the people, they make them their servants, but at the end of the day, the book of Joshua shows us again that even at their best, the Israelites are a mixed bag of faithful obedience kind of mingled together with, well, you know, we might be faithful to God, we might not be faithful to God, we'll kind of do our best, but what does Joshua say at the end? He says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Choose whom you will serve. And so as we get to the book of Judges, that's really where we're at. That's kind of the background. Israel has just come out of Egypt, but due to a lack of faith, they had to spend 40 years in the wilderness. And now, having come into the promised land, they did not complete the conquest of Canaan. And this is key. This is crucial. Remember, God told them to drive out all of the people who lived in the land. Why? Not because God had some kind of like ethnophobia or something. We're going to get to that, talk about Ruth at the end. No, it wasn't that God thought the Israelites needed to be ethnically superior or ethnically somehow like cleansed from all of these other people. No, the idea was God did not want the religions of those people to somehow infiltrate the hearts of the Israelites. Why? Because he wanted them to be pure-hearted. He wanted their devotion to be genuine and complete. And so he says to the Israelites, listen, if you let the other people live among you, what's going to happen? He says this in Deuteronomy and other places. Your heart is going to go after their gods, at which point your devotion to me will not be true. And what does God tell us? He says, I am a jealous God. I'm not someone who wants to share your devotion. I'm not a God who deserves half of your heart or 90% of your heart. I am the only true God, and I want it all. So they didn't complete the conquest. So the challenge for Israel will be whether they will remain true to God and his law as they settle in the land of promise. Now, again, Joshua, here's how the book of Joshua ends. That basically for as long as Joshua lived, the people were faithful. That generation was really probably one of the best generations in all of Israel's history. Joshua and the people who lived in his time followed the Lord faithfully, not perfectly, but faithfully. Now in the book of Judges, here's basically what's happened. Joshua is dead. So Joshua begins with Moses dying. The book of Judges begins with Joshua dying. And now the question will be, all right, Israelites, God's brought you to the promised land. There's all of these other people that you failed to drive out. Now, what will you do with this land that God has given you? How will you respond? And just to spoiler alert, the whole book of Judges, it goes horribly wrong. The people of Israel fail on basically every front. In fact, if we were to kind of summarize the book of Judges, it would be Israel fails to follow the law. They fail to obey God. They fail to follow his ways. It's just basically like Israel's biggest failures is the book of Judges. It's a very dark book. It's got a very dark background. And it begins in Judges 1 through 2:5. And this is what we're going to do tonight. We're basically going to do a flyover the book of Judges. We're going to talk as fast as we can, pretty literally, through several of the major judges. But it's really going to be to paint this bleak backdrop. And then we're going to come back on the other side and do some takeaways. And then probably in a 2-minute flurry, we're going to talk about Ruth. So Judges 1 through 2:5, Israel's failure. It basically outlines the fact that there were some of the tribes, Judah and Simeon, that really, they did pretty good in driving out the enemies. But most of the tribes, they basically get there, they kind of get their feet under them, and they say, well, do we really have to, go to war to get these people out? Can't we just kind of sit back and relax and enjoy the promised land? And so they don't drive out their foes. The tribes had a measure of success. They forced people into servitude. In other words, the people of the time didn't really want to rise up and fight against them, at least at the beginning. But the Israelites didn't drive them out. And so that failure almost immediately in the book of Judges leads to the Israelites intermingling with the Canaanites, the people who lived in the promised land, and then almost immediately following after those foreign gods. This is why we know people like Baal or Molech or Dagon, or we know the names of the Philistines or other groups like that, because they were still there and they infiltrated the Israelites so that the Israelites' heart almost immediately go astray. So think of it like this. Joshua ends, choose this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we'll choose the Lord. The people say, yeah, we'll choose the Lord too. But then within a few years, and certainly within a generation, they don't choose the Lord. They choose the foreign gods. And Judges shows us what happens whenever you choose to follow foreign gods. So the book of Judges follows a cycle. Okay? And this cycle is a cycle that's on repeat throughout the book of Judges. Essentially, it goes like this. It says that the Israelites sinned by worshiping foreign gods. There was a foreign occupier who came in, whether it was the Ammonites or the Moabites or the Philistines or whoever it might be. A foreign power comes in, takes over. The Israelites cry out to God, God, please help us. These people are taking us over, at which point God sends a deliverer or a judge who comes and saves them. So the Israelites follow foreign gods. God hands them over to their enemies. Israel cries out, God raises up a judge, and then basically after that judge dies, the Israelites just go right back to it. And it really is truly kind of a depressing story of like almost a dog returning to its vomit. You would think that the Israelites would kind of eventually wake up and say, well, wait a minute, why don't we serve the true God? Why don't we serve the God who brought us out of Egypt? But what we're going to see is that Judges is really a picture of depravity, that people left to their own devices, people, as the book of Judges is going to say multiple times, when they have no king, when they have no leader, when they have no sense that, hey, God and God alone is deserving of our worship, when they're left to their own devices, things fall apart very quickly. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's basically a microcosm that we already saw in Genesis 1 through 11, but it's writ large here in the book of Judges, and we're going to talk about that. So, what is a judge? This is very interesting, okay? When we think of judge, we immediately think of like a legal context, right? I mean, you go before a judge has a gavel, a judge has the power to sentence you. You know, you always have to be nice to the judge because the judge holds all the cards, right? Well, really, it's kind of a misnomer to call the people in the book of Judges, judges, at least in the modern sense. And here's why. Because every one of the judges really arises in a military context. So again, foreign occupier, foreign enemy, the judge arises basically to deliver. Okay? Now, there are some indications that the judges were intended to have a teaching function as well. We see that at the beginning of the book of Judges where it says the judges tried to teach the Israelites, but the Israelites wouldn't listen. But mainly, the judges are meant to be deliverers. Now, here's something else that's worth pointing out. And there's a little bit of debate about this, but I think this is probably the best reading, is that the judges were likely regional leaders. Okay, so the reason I've got like the sheriff graphic is, I think that's a really good kind of encapsulation. When you think of like the local sheriff is meant to take care of the law in these parts, right? I mean, you cross the county lines, all of a sudden you're in another jurisdiction. So here's the thing, these leaders were probably regional leaders. They probably did not judge all of Israel, just on their own at one time. They could have worked concurrently with one another. And there's some debate about that, but here's another thing that's going to become evident as we look to the judges in detail. The judges themselves are not moral exemplars, right? They are not, it's not like, okay, look at what the judges do and model your life after the judges. That would be a very, very bad idea. Why? Because just like the people of Israel as a whole, the judges, by and large, there are some exceptions, we'll talk about those. By and large, the judges were people who also did what was right in their own eyes. And think of Samson, or we're going to talk about Gideon. Usually we think of Gideon as a great judge. We're going to really kind of challenge that tonight. Gideon really did not end well at all. But when we think of the judges, okay, the judges were by and large military deliverers who God raised up. And here's what often the judges are described as. It says, the Spirit of the Lord comes on them and God uses them to deliver his people. That doesn't mean that God endorses all of their behavior. It doesn't mean that they're even righteous. But it means that God uses them, and I think there's a lesson there for us, and we're going to talk about that in the end, okay? First judge, all right, if you're keeping track at home, I think there are 14 judges maybe. Someone can double check that. It's in the textbook, and you can Google it easily. But there were something like 12 or 14 judges. Some of them were major, and there's lots of descriptions about them. Some of them are minor, and it basically has only a sentence or two. We're not going to talk about every judge, but we're going to talk about the major judges tonight, beginning with Othnio, okay? This is in Judges chapter 3, verses 7 through 12. Othniel is the first judge that's mentioned. He's the son-in-law of Caleb, and you may remember Caleb. He was one of the 12 spies, one of the only two who of the original spies said, no, we can go and we can take the promised land. And essentially, here's what Caleb did. There was some land that he wanted to take over, and he said, okay, anyone who goes and takes over this land, there's some really powerful guys there. Anyone who goes and gets those guys out of there, I'll give my daughter to that person in marriage. Othniel says, oh, I want to do that. So he goes, drives them all out, establishes himself in that land, and eventually it says that he becomes the first judge. Now, here's why we mention Othniel. There's not a whole lot of information about him, but he does set a precedent. Okay? The first thing we see is that the Spirit of God comes on Othnio. And that's something that we really see throughout the book of Judges. In other words, and don't miss this, it's not because the judges are super magical, superhero-like people that they can deliver Israel. It's the fact that the Spirit of God comes on them, that God uses them as vessels, but it's not them in their own strength. Okay? So the Spirit of God comes on him, and Othniel then delivers Israel from the king of Aram. Okay? Othniel's the first judge. All right? Next judge we're going to talk about. One of my favorites, just because the story is really kind of hilarious in a number of ways, Ehud, or some might say Ehud. I don't really know, and that's okay, all right? We're going to call him Ehud because that sounds funnier. And Ehud was a left-handed judge. Now, my wife is left-handed. She always tells me the world is created for right-handed people, but this biblical story shows that, hey, there were some left-handed heroes even in the Bible. Now, Ehud was a left-handed man, all right? And the reason why, you might say, well, why is that included? Here's why it's included, because it's important to Ehud's story. Here's what happened. Eglon, the king of Moab, keep that in the back of your mind, because remember, Ruth is what? A Moabite. We're going to talk about that later. But Eglon, the king of Moab, evil guy, horrible guy, he comes and he starts oppressing Israel, okay? God raises up Ehud, and Ehud basically goes to him. The king of Moab said to the Israelites, you have to pay me tribute, okay? So every year they have to go bring him tribute. Well, Ehud goes as a leader of the Israelites, and here's what he does. He straps a sword on his left thigh. You know why? Because they only checked. Like if you're doing, like a body search, okay, are there any weapons? No, he's clean. Well, they just assume 90% of people are normal and right-handed. And so, they'd probably strap the sword on the right side. And so they didn't check the left side. Yeah, this is going to be a hard night for me when this is all said and done, but that's all right. No. So he basically, Ehud goes to the king of Moab and he says, hey, listen, king, I've got some secret information that I need to tell you just one-on-one. So can we have a private audience? At which point the king says, oh yeah, I want to know this. And so Ehud does what? He goes into the private chamber of the king. And at that point, what does he do? Whoosh, whips out the sword. And here's the crazy part. Eglon is so fat, like literally he's so huge that Ehud stabs him with the sword and the fat on the king sucks in the sword. And you can read this yourself. I'm not making this up. This is in the Bible, okay? The fat is literally sucks in the sword. Ehud is there in his private room. Ehud isn't. The king is. Ehud flees out the window and goes and gets a head start. Well, then eventually all of the king's servants think, well, maybe the king went to the bathroom or something. So they just kind of leave him alone for a while. And eventually they realize, no, that's not right. They come in, they find him dead. But God uses Ehud to deliver the people of Israel. Ehud goes, he rallies troops, and basically they come and they defeat Moab in a larger way. And that's going to be a common theme basically with all of these judges, is a lot of times they'll go through some kind of peak moment where, the judge does something special. Think Gideon, we're going to talk about him in a minute, but the judge does something special, or a small group of people do something. And then after, Ehud kills the king, then he calls all the Israelites to kind of come help, and then they run off all the Moabites. So it's kind of starts small, but grows as it continues, okay? So that's Ehud or Ehud in Judges chapter 3. The next judge is very interesting, and we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about her. Her name is Deborah. And the reason that she's interesting is, there are a number of reasons, but one of the reasons is she is a she. Okay, so when we look at Judges chapter 4 and 5, Deborah is described as both a prophetess and a judge. Now that's interesting in and of itself. As we're going to see, she actually is going to prophesy something that comes true. But here's why there's some controversy about Deborah, and there's some debate about her, because she is a woman who is leading in some capacity in Israel. In fact, at the beginning of Judges chapter 4, it says that she would settle disputes between Israelites. So apparently she had some kind of authority to settle disputes as a prophet and as a judge. But here's basically the story of Deborah in a nutshell, and we'll talk about the debate in a minute. The story is, okay, that Sisera was a major player at the time, okay, militarily, and Sisera and his army came to attack Israel. Well, basically what happened is that Deborah, who again is a judge and a prophetess, she summons or calls Barak, who's the military leader at that time, okay, and she says, hey, Barak, Sisera's on the loose. You need to go take him down, Barak. Barak was the military leader. And Barak says, okay, I'll go and fight him, but I'll only fight him if you come with me, all right? So he says, he almost treats Deborah like the good luck charm. Like, Deborah, apparently, there's something about you that God talks to you and you're a prophetess. And so if you come with me, then I'll go fight Sisera. But if you don't, then I won't. At which point Deborah says to him, she says, okay, I'll go with you. But here's what you need to know, Barak. The person who's going to get the honor is not you, because actually Sisera is going to be killed by a woman. Now, immediately in the narrative, you're kind of thinking, well, Deborah's a woman, okay? And so maybe she's talking about herself. But the weird twist to the story is actually it's another woman, Jael, who ends up killing Sisera with a tent peg. We'll get there in a second. But basically what happens is there's a big battle. God once again intervenes on behalf of Israel, because it's not because Israel's mighty that they win these battles. God intervenes on their behalf. Sisera flees from the battle, and he goes to the tent of a woman named Jael. Now, he basically thinks that Jael might be on his side. Jael gives him, she kind of, oh, come in here, Sisera, hide here. I'll take care of you. She gives him a cup of milk or cream. And basically, Sisera's been fighting all day. So, of course, he's tired. He gets, eats this nice meal. So what does he do? He goes and lays down, at which point Jael takes a tent peg, don't take a nap at Jael's house, right? She takes the tent peg and boom, literally drives his head into the ground and kills Sisera. At which point, Deborah's prophecy at the beginning comes true. Barak doesn't receive the glory. Why? Because Sisera is killed by a woman. Okay, now, we're not going to belabor this point because it's kind of small in the book of Judges, but there's debate over the significance of Deborah as a judge, and here's why there's debate. Some people would look at Deborah and her leadership and basically say, well, this is indicative of the times of the judges. Because after all, there was no king, and so everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So they would say that Deborah isn't really like a model that's universal. They would say that Deborah is more like an anomaly of the times in which she lived. And there's a lot of debate about that, but what's interesting is when you read through Judges 4, she's basically introduced, and there's really not a lot of explanation. It just says, Deborah was judging at the time. She judged under the tree. She was a prophetess, and people came to settle their disputes with Deborah. And so that's why there's debate. There's nothing textually that says this was an anomaly or this was an aberration. But when you look at the context of this was a time when everyone did what was right in their own eyes, perhaps some argue that shows that Deborah was not meant to be a model to be followed. Just as an aside, there are no other female judges in the book of Judges. There are other female prophets in the Old Testament, but we might talk about that more when we get into the prophets. But if you want to ask questions about that, we can do that at the end. We got to fly fast because we're going through a lot of material. Gideon is a story that we know a little bit better, okay? And we're skipping over some of the smaller stories there. If you have questions on those, I'll do my best. There's a lot of material to cover. But Gideon, we remember Gideon. Why? Because Gideon was one who tested God. Remember? And essentially, God comes to Gideon. Again, Midian is oppressing Israel at this point, and it's so interesting. Sometimes it's the Moabites. Sometimes it's the Midianites. Sometimes it's the Philistines. The Israelites have a lot of enemies. Why? Because they failed to drive them out. There's a lot of ways to fall, but basically, God raises up Gideon, at which point, I'm going to read this quote, and you've got it in your notes. Gideon says something that I think is really indicative of how many of the Israelites felt. The angel of the Lord comes to Gideon, basically says, hey, I'm choosing you, you're going to fight. And Gideon said to him, please, my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why has all of this happened? In other words, why are the Midianites coming and oppressing us? Why are all of the foreign enemies of God coming and defeating us in battle? If God is with us, if we're his chosen people, if he wants us to be a kingdom of priests, why is this happening? And where are all his wonders that our fathers told us about? They said, hasn't the Lord brought us out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to Midian. So if you want to know kind of like the psychology of the Israelites in one sense, they're looking at the situation and they're not saying, oh yeah, the God of our fathers, the God who defeated Pharaoh, the God who brought us into the promised land through the Jordan River. No, they're not thinking those things. They're thinking, well, God did that in the past, but it feels like he's abandoned us now. Where's God? Where's God in all of this? At which point, what does God do? He proves himself once again. But if you want to see the faithlessness and even the questioning of the Israelites on display, here's what they basically say. Well, maybe God did some things in the past, but here was their mindset. Maybe we have to look to other gods right now. Maybe what we should do is just kind of, bend our knee to the Midianites for a while and just kind of, hedge our bets, if you will. We'll worship Yahweh, but maybe we'll worship Baal too, or maybe we'll worship Asherah, or maybe we'll worship Dagon. And it was a syncretistic, let's do everything to cover our bases. It was that kind of mindset, which of course God says doesn't work for him. So Gideon, as you know, and we can't go through the whole story, he basically tests God saying, God, I'm going to put this fleece out. It's going to be wet. Can you make it dry? Then he says, God, I've got this fleece that's dry. Now can you make it wet? And God reverses it, does the miracle, shows that he's actually there, that he's actually faithful, at which point Gideon eventually follows. But you remember the story. They start off with a mighty group of people. God whittles it down so that there's just a few hundred who are following Gideon. And they go into the camp, and you remember the story. They're supposed to all get their pots and their torches, and they surround the Midianites. They break the torches to make a loud clamor. They show their torches so that it seems like there's a huge army. They blow their trumpets, but God defeats the Midianites not with a great army, but just with a few hundred. Why? To show that it's truly him. And at that point, things seem to be going great for old Gideon, right? I mean, when we think Gideon, people name their kids Gideon, right? I mean, some people, I have I hope my family's not going to watch this recording because I have like a cousin, nephew-ish person who's named Gideon. So anyway, forget that I said that. Greg, maybe we can scrap that from the final video. But anyway, I'm totally kidding. Okay, that's a joke. You laugh at my jokes, things go better. Okay, Gideon. Normally we think of Gideon as good. And to be sure, there were some high points for Gideon. But here's what happens with Gideon. By the end of his life, Gideon, it says, has many wives. Okay, that says any. Okay, it should be many. Gideon has many wives. Okay, he creates an ephod out of like the precious metals, gold and silver, that he has people come and give to him. They're like, Gideon, you saved us. We want to give you all this money. Okay, give it to me. And then he crafts this thing that all of the people end up worshiping. So it's almost like the golden calf 2.0. But then the most indicting thing is that Gideon names his son Abimelech. And Abimelech means, my father is king. So if you've got a dad who's naming his son, my father is king, what does that tell you about Gideon? He started out being like, God, please give me the sign. Who am I that you should use me? That was Gideon's mentality. But eventually he gets too big for his own britches and he names his own son, my father is king. At the end of the day, that son actually murders all of the other sons of Gideon, shows the horrible depravity that started with Gideon. But here's the thing. God uses Gideon to save, but is Gideon infected by the same sinful tendencies as everybody else? By the end, the answer is yes. So Gideon starts out good, but he doesn't end well. And of course, that's a pattern that we see with many people. We see it with Saul. We see it with Solomon. We see it with many. He starts off good, but ends up not good. All right. Again, we're going to have to fly Jephthah. Okay, another example of someone that God uses to deliver, but he's not someone that you would say, hey, model your life after Jephthah. This is Judges chapter 11, verses 12, chapter 11 through 12:6, okay? Once again, and you see, again, it's a cycle. It's a cycle, okay? Same thing happens. It sounds very familiar. Israel worships foreign gods. They cry out for a deliverer, but here's the thing with Jephthah. Jephthah was actually an illegitimate child. Okay, Jephthah's dad was actually married to a woman. Jephthah was born by another woman. So all of the legitimate sons of Jephthah's father basically said, hey, we don't want you here. They drove Jephthah out. But here was the thing about Jephthah. Jephthah was also like a military man. He was a great warrior. And so whenever the enemies of Israel rose up, they said, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't have driven out old Jephthah because now we need him. So they go to Jephthah and they basically say, Jephthah, I know we hated your guts. I know we made you leave. I know we treated you like trash and because after all, you were illegitimate. But Jephthah, will you please come and help us and deliver us? And Jephthah says, why would I do that? And they say, well, we need you. And he says, okay, then you got to promise that you're going to actually make me the leader. They say, we swear we will. But Jephthah makes this rash vow where he basically says, okay, God, I'll go and I'll fight. And God, if you will give me victory, I will sacrifice to you the first thing that comes out the door when I get home. So not exactly what you'd say a man of like great faith. One, he's making a vow for victory, but then two, what do you mean you'll sacrifice the first thing that comes out? Well, that's the vow that he makes, all right? And so he goes to battle, they win the victory, he comes home, and guess who comes out to meet him? His daughter. At which point, okay, Jephthah, you made a vow to God. What are you going to do? And that's where there's some mystery in the text. There's some debate about what Jephthah actually does. Some people believe he actually offered his daughter as a burnt offering, killed her and offered her. There's a very good argument that that's what he did. The other position essentially is, and this is based on the daughter's response, because basically before the daughter is sacrificed, whatever that might mean, she asks her father, can I go, and what she says is, can I go mourn my virginity with all of my other friends? And so she goes off for a period of time, comes back after she mourns her virginity, and then her father fulfills the vow. So some argue, based on what she says, is that perhaps the sacrifice wasn't that he killed his daughter, but perhaps the sacrifice was that his daughter had to live in perpetual virginity, just basically means she couldn't get married because of Jephthah's vow. So there are various opinions on that, but here's the point. Either way, that's nothing that God ever commanded, commended, wanted, asked for. And yet Jephthah, doing what's right in his own eyes, does something that obviously cost someone that he loved very dearly. And again, here's kind of the emphasis of Judges. You think, well, that's crazy. That's the point, right? We read the book of Judges and say, this is insane. God says, yes, it is insane, but this is what happens whenever you don't follow my laws. Like, this is the kind of world that comes about whenever you do what's right in your own eyes. Next one we know well, Samson. But the same thing, we think of Samson primarily as like the super strong, like Superman of the Old Testament, right? And I've never seen Samson, so I don't want to give Sight and Sound Theater a bad rap. I'm sure it was a really great show, but I hope they really did follow the biblical story, because Samson was like certified mental. And by that, I mean, Samson grew up as a Nazarite, okay? And a Nazarite simply meant that he was dedicated to God from birth. There were certain rules that the Nazarites had to follow. We talked about that when we went through the book of Numbers. But Samson actually had kind of a miraculous birth. Like, the angel of the Lord comes to Samson's dad and mom and says, hey, you're going to have a baby. You're going to dedicate him to the Lord. The Lord's going to use him to deliver. It's going to be awesome. At which point they say, amazing. Samson's born, but immediately, even though Samson, and don't miss this, according to the law, was supposed to be one of the most set apart, holy people in all of Israel as a Nazarite, what does he do? He basically breaks every command that you can imagine. He goes to his parents and he says, Mom and Dad, I don't want an Israelite wife. I want a Philistine wife. And his parents are like, well, don't you think you should do like a Israelite wife? He says, no, I want a Philistine. That's who I want. Well, then on the way to go get his Philistine wife, what does he do? He kills a lion. And guess what? A Nazarite wasn't allowed to be around death at all. Huge no-no. And what does he do? Kills the lion, comes back to it when it's dead, sees there's honey in it, and then he eats the honey from the dead lion. Broke every uncleanliness law in the book, and absolutely broke the Nazarite law. But in any case, that's what he did. And that's just the beginning of the story. As you think about Samson, again, he took a wife from the Philistines. That led to conflict. It was all a big crazy misunderstanding because the Philistines basically said, Samson, we won't go through the whole story, but basically, hey, Samson said, here's a riddle for you. And the Philistines said, well, we don't know the riddle. It was about the dead lion, and you can read about it yourself. But it was about the dead lion. Samson's fiance, basically, eventually on the last day that they could get the riddle, came and got Samson to tell her the riddle, at which point then Samson goes crazy, kills 30 people so that he can pay off what the bet was for the riddle. I mean, literally, I'm not making this up. You can read through Judges. It's crazy stuff. Samson pays for the riddle, at which point then the father-in-law is like, well, I'm not sure about this. Samson goes away for a while, comes back to get the woman later. The father-in-law says, oh, I didn't think you wanted her, at which point then Samson goes crazy again, kills a bunch of Philistines. Then later, okay, so that's not even, we haven't even got to Delilah yet. Okay, later, Samson meets Delilah, who also is a Philistine. Okay, goes to Delilah, falls in love with her. Samson had serious woman issues. Why? Because he was led astray, by his own eyes. Don't miss that. He's led astray by his own eyes, finds Delilah, basically says, I want Delilah, marries her, but then Delilah says, what's the secret of your strength? Well, what does Samson do? He just lies to her. But then eventually, you know the rest of the story, eventually he does tell her the secret. They come in, after multiple attempts, they come in, shave his head, or she shaves his head, and then they come in, and he doesn't have his strength anymore, at which point, what do? They put out his eyes. They force him into subjugation in the temple of Dagon. Eventually his hair begins to grow back, and God gives him his strength once more. And by the end, he kills a bunch of Philistines by pushing down the temple of Dagon. And here's the point. Samson, in one sense, is like the culmination. He's the last judge that's talked about in the book of Judges. And he really is the culmination of the absolute foolishness of his time. Now, the amazing thing is, and we're going to talk about this in a second, God still uses him. But the idea that somehow Samson is someone to emulate is absolutely wrong. Samson was someone who defied God's laws, didn't care about his own oath that his parents had given, that he was dedicated to God from the beginning. And yet God, in his mercy, still used Samson to help others. But Samson was an absolute wreck of a judge, of a model. And yet that's part of the point. Even in a dark moment, God can use broken vessels. Now, the last part is Judges 17 through 21. And I'll just warn you, it's one thing to stand up here, and I'm trying to keep it lighthearted, but Judges 17 through 21 is like rated X. And I don't mean like rated R, I mean like rated X. It's horrible. And even reading it, it's just it's horrible. It's sick. But again, that's the point. And I think it's so important for us to remind ourselves that God is not in the business of somehow ironing over the depravity of man. In fact, we're reading the inspired scriptures where God, for all of eternity, says, I want you to look as in a mirror to see how bad things are whenever you abandon me. So this is going to be tough to read or to talk about. But again, this is God pulling back the veil and saying, this is depravity on display. All right? Here's how the story basically unfolds. There was an Ephraimite man. Ephraim, again, was one of the 12 tribes, or was one of the sub-tribes of Joseph. Joseph had two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. But there was an Ephraimite named Micah, and here's what he did. He had some money. It's kind of an interesting story how he got the money, but he has some money, 1,100 silver coins. He melts them down and then crafts them once again into what? An idol. Not worshiping God, breaks the second commandment. You shall have no idols, okay? But he crafts it into an idol, and then here's what he does. There's a Levite who's roaming around. Remember, the Levites didn't have any particular land. They lived all over Israel. Levite walking around, at which point Micah says, hey, Levite, why don't you come and live with me? You can be like my personal family chaplain. Work for me. You can work in my idol place, and I'll pay you. I'll give you some money. It'll be nice, cush career. And what happens? The Levite joins, he goes and works for this man, but then something else happens. There's a group of Danites, okay? Dan is, of course, another tribe. And the Danites, by the way, all throughout Scripture really get a bad rap. But there are some Danites, and there are a lot more Danites than there are of old Micah's tribe, okay? So the Danites come, and there's hundreds of them, and they basically come and say, hey, there's this super valuable idol. Let's steal it. Let's take it for ourselves. Oh, but as they come and do it, the Levite's there, and the Levite says, hey, why are you trying to steal this idol? And they say, hey, don't say anything. Levite, you come and work for us. We're going to give you an upgrade. We're going to give you a pay raise. Why would you just be the Levite for a house when you could be the Levite for a whole tribe? At which point the Levite says, sounds like a good gig to me. Goes with the Danites, okay? They steal the idol, they take the priest for themselves, and here's the kicker. You know who later the priest is identified as? The son, possibly grandson. Maybe it's not literally the son, maybe it's in the line of, we don't know. But who's the Levite who does this? The son of Moses. Wow. Talk about breaking the law, talk about the apple falling far from the tree, and here's the point. If this is how the son or the grandson of Moses is behaving, then how is everybody else behaving? Total anarchy, total lawlessness. They've fallen away from the law completely. Now you might think, okay, well, yeah, that's bad, and shouldn't the son of Moses know better, the grandson of Moses? Yes, he should, but this is where it just gets even crazier, okay? So as it continues, the last part of the book of Judges, it says this, okay, there's another Levite. And this goes to show you, right? The Levites are the people who should know better. The Levites, if anyone should be faithful, it's the Levites. But the Levites are the people who don't follow the law, okay? There's another Levite who has a concubine, all right? And there's some debate again as to whether this was a wife or whether it was a concubine who was basically a lower status than sort of a normal wife. But here's the point. He basically treats her as what? A sex slave, not as a wife in any kind of honorable way at all, okay? The Levite's concubine actually returns to her father. It's kind of under weird circumstances that she goes back, but she's back with her father, at which point the Levite comes to her and says, hey, I want you to come back and be with me. He talks it over with her and the father-in-law. She comes back, but as they go back, he's going home, and here's what he knows. Dangerous times, wild, wild west, okay? I'm going back home, but here's what he says. I don't want to stop in a town that's not lived in by Israelites, that's not controlled by Israelites, at which point we might think, well, that makes sense. Probably the Levite doesn't want to stop at the Philistine town or, the Midianite town or whatever, okay? He wants to stay where there are Israelites, and so he does. Doesn't stop here, doesn't stop here. Eventually, he stops in a town called Gibeah that's lived in by Benjamites. And he thinks, okay, Israelites are here. I'm going to be good. It's going to be fine. Goes out to the city square. There's going to be some resonances here with a story that's already been told in Genesis, okay? He goes to the city square, at which point the hospitality culture of the day would have said that you have to, if someone comes, if a foreign person comes, you're to welcome them in. So he goes to the city square. Who's going to welcome me in? There's one man who says, stay with me. Don't go to anyone else. Why? Because everyone else is not going to treat you right. In fact, here's literally what they say. It says that the men of the town who were Israelites, they come to this man and they say, okay, Levite, you come out here and we're going to have sex with you. Is what he said, or is what they say. It is almost literally a recasting of what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember that story? The angels come, they go into the house of Lot. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah say, come, bring them out. We're going to have sex with you. Same thing happens, but again, this isn't in some place that has no knowledge of God. This is in Israel, in a town where this Levite says, well, here's where I'm coming to be safe from all the others. And here's the point. And I want you to see the thread throughout. What happens when the Israelites don't obey God? Well, over time, the Israelites become not just assimilated to the culture they were supposed to be separate from, they actually become even worse than that culture. So that the Israelites, who are supposed to be a kingdom of priests, are now not taking out the other people, they are infighting, they are consuming themselves, they are absolutely immoral and unholy. And they basically say to this guy, come out. At which point you might say, well, the Levite and the guy who was helping him, you know what they probably would have said? Well, no, we're going to be holy. We're going to be righteous. God's going to deliver us. No, that's not what they said. The man who was hosting them, like Lot did, and the man himself, here's what they said. Nope, don't do that to us. Here's my virgin daughter, and here's my concubine. Take them. But don't do that to us. At which point the men aren't satisfied with that. They basically break down the doors or break in somehow, take the guy's concubine. And again, this is dark stuff, okay? Like it's not even easy to say. It's just so disgusting. But what do? They rape her all night, leave her on the doorstep. The guy wakes up the next day, takes her, and says, come on, let's go. She doesn't move. The text doesn't even actually say that she dies. We assume that she dies. I hope so, because what does the Levite then do? He literally takes her body, chops it up into 12 parts, sends it throughout the 12 tribes of Israel, at which point, to their credit, he says to them, this thing has happened in Israel. How can this happen? And the other tribes basically come and say, this, we're all bad. We've all assimilated, but we can't put up with this. They come, they wage war on the Benjamites. They basically say, we're going to wipe out the Benjamites. This is a horrible thing. And then at that point, they realize, okay, well, we can't just exterminate a whole tribe. They leave 600 Benjamites, but they had all made a vow that they wouldn't give their daughters to the Benjamites. So what do? They say to the Benjamites, okay, if you're not going to be exterminated, you have to have wives. They throw a party where then there's basically 600 virgins of another tribe, and then the 600 Benjamites who don't have wives, they say, just go steal them because we can't give them to you. You have to go steal them for yourselves. So they throw a party where their own daughters can be stolen by the Benjamites so that the Benjamite tribe can still exist. And guess what? That's where it ends. I mean, talk about dark. The final commentary is what? This was the time when every man did what was right in his own eyes. There was no king. There was no fidelity to the law. And this was an indictment of Israel in every way. Israel, you're faithless, you don't trust God, you're disobedient, you don't love God, you're worshiping all of these other gods. Israel, look at what happens whenever you follow your own eyes instead of trusting in the Lord. You remember what God says at the beginning of Joshua? He says, Joshua, be strong and courageous. Don't turn from the right or the left from the law that I've given to you. And by the end of the book of Judges, everything is falling apart. And again, that's the indictment. And God does not want us to miss the absolute horror of life without him. Israel ends up worshiping foreign gods, turning in on itself rather than driving out the enemy and worshiping the Lord. At which point comes in the story of Ruth. Now, just very briefly, some actually argue that Ruth isn't really its own standalone book, but that Ruth is actually an epilogue to the book of Judges. That may or may not be true, but in any case, here's why that's so important. Because at the beginning of Ruth, here's what it says, in the days when the judges judged. So it's in this time frame, right? And I'm not saying this is what it says, but you can just imagine this. As the end of the book of Judges is happening, meanwhile, Ruth, okay, same time period. Ruth is a Moabite. Well, Moabites are enemies of God. We know that. Ahab killed the king of the Moabites. And yet, this Moabite is different. And this once again proves that it was never about ethnic cleansing. It was never about, God doesn't want, his people to be diluted with other people. No, the point was God didn't want them to follow the gods of the other people, because when you follow the gods of the other people, you do what all of the other gods do. Which is what? All of the things that the Israelites did. Murder, disobey, all the rest. They were basically following the gods of the Canaanites in their behavior. But in any case, the book of Ruth is in this period, but Ruth, who is a Moabite, shows that faithfulness is possible. And I wish we had time. The book of Ruth is amazing in so many ways. Ruth had every reason not to trust in the God of Israel. But what does she say? She says, listen, she says this to Naomi, her mother-in-law. She says, your God will be my God, your people will be my people. Where you live, I'll live. Where you die, I'll die. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death parts me and you. I am going with you, Naomi. At which point, Naomi says, okay, fine. Actually, she doesn't say anything. She just goes, and Ruth follows her. But Ruth is faithful. Ruth is humble. And Boaz comes along and he says, listen, may the Lord, the God of Israel, may you find refuge under his wings. Because he realizes Ruth has given up everything to trust the God of the Israelites. Think about the Israelites. The Israelites didn't trust the God of the Israelites, but Ruth did. Which is why God is saying, listen, you're meant to be a missionary nation, a kingdom of priests. The other nations, if you would just follow me, there are people who would look to you and say, yes, we want to be part of this. Yes, we want to worship this God. Ruth said, I don't want any other God. I want your God. The Israelites said, we want all the other gods. Ruth is an indictment against all of the brokenness. But here's the amazing thing. Through Ruth and through faithful people like Boaz, who are with her, God is working to redeem the brokenness of faithless Israel. And throughout Ruth, there are so many different instances of it. Ruth, for instance, Ruth happened to be working in the field that Boaz owned. Oh, well, he just happened to be her kinsman redeemer. And the person who should have been the kinsman redeemer just happened to not want to. And there are all kinds of sovereign moments in the book of Ruth that remind us of that. But at the end, Ruth marries Boaz. They have a child, and that child turns out to be rather famous. Not necessarily because of himself, but his name is Obed. Obed is the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of David. So Ruth, who is an enemy of God, Moabite, ends up being the great-grandmother of King David. And also she's mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1, okay? We're going to talk about some takeaways, and then we're going to end with some questions. Takeaways from Judges and Ruth. Again, I wish we had more time to talk about Ruth. God's faithfulness despite human sin. You see Israel at its absolute worst, or at least one of its worst periods in the book of Judges, but what do we see? God is faithful. Even when Israel doesn't deserve it, God still shows them mercy and sends them a deliverer. And so we see that God is faithful to his promises even when human beings aren't. Second thing we see, and this is so important, God is willing to use imperfect vessels. And, you look at people like Gideon and Jephthah and Samson, for goodness sake, and you're just like, why doesn't God just wash his hands clean of these people? They don't care about God. And yet God, it's almost like God is looking for a way to show mercy to people. And God's willing to use them, imperfect as they are. Now listen, we're going to talk about this in a second. That doesn't mean God's endorsing them. That doesn't mean God wants you to be like them. But God uses imperfect vessels in powerful ways in the book of Judges. Okay? Also, and this is interesting to me, our human tendency, think the end of the book of Judges, is to justify our human behavior by looking to godly, quote unquote, priests. I mean, think what Micah did. Micah, at the end of the book of Judges, he builds this golden calf to himself, or silver calf to himself. But what does he do? Hey, there's a Levite. I'm going to have the Levite come in. And if I've got a Levite, everything's got to be okay. What does Paul say? He says people will surround themselves with teachers who tell them what their itching ears want to hear. Well, man, if the son of Moses or the grandson of Moses is my priest, surely I'm good with God, right? Well, it doesn't work that way. But that's our tendency, isn't it? To try to look to people who will justify our own sin. But, and this is, I think, maybe the most important one, God doesn't hold back on describing the brokenness of the world. And I think this is strangely comforting, and here's why. Christianity is a religion of good news, right? I mean, we share the most incredible news that God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. Like, we preach this amazing news that many people look at Christians and are like, that's just pie in the sky, too good to be true, just a bunch of holy nonsense, right? Like, you Christians just go around thinking, oh, everything's fine because God works all things together for good, and just roses and cupcakes and unicorns and rainbows. And you Christians, you don't know what reality's like. At which point we say, wait a second, The same God who sent his son also showed us the absolute horror of who we are. When you read the Bible isn't a book of fairy tale princesses. No, the Bible is a book of real people who have real, really cruddy stuff in their life. But there's a comfort in that we don't serve a God, and don't miss this, we don't serve a God who turns his face away from evil. God will eventually judge evil. Why? Because God is the ultimate judge. He's the ultimate deliverer. He's the ultimate arbiter. He's the one who will right every wrong, including the wrong of people who claim to live by his name and as his people. So the fact that the Bible doesn't pull its punches and it shows us our own depravity, shows us that God sees it and that God will judge it and ultimately set all things together to their right. It also, by the way, shows us the absolute grace of God that he would send his son for those people. For us. And now I want to end with a reminder, then we're going to do questions for the time we have left. And this is so crucial. Please don't miss this. The Bible's description of people, events, or actions is not the same as God's endorsement of people, events, or actions. And this is an error that so many people make. They look at the Old Testament and be like, oh, Samson. Samson was God's guy. Well, God used Samson, but that doesn't mean that God endorsed Samson's behavior. Huge difference between God describing something or allowing something and God endorsing something. And that's very important in the book of Judges. So we're going to end. We got about 5 minutes to do questions. So there's a whole lot here, but we can take questions for the time we have left. Yeah, so good question, and there's debate on this as there is on everything. And this is why some people argue that the judges were overlapping with each other. Some people argue that they were totally linear and that you have to add the years up. But the timeline is, okay, Moses brings the people of Israel out of Egypt somewhere. The probably the best timeline is 1440s or so. So for the next 400 years, okay, the Israelites essentially live in the period of the judges. So it's a very long period of time. It's a very dark period of time. Eventually, of course, Samuel will arise as the last judge, as well as one of the first major prophets. And then Saul will become the first king. So it's an in-between period after Moses and Joshua and before the first king, approximately 400 years. Approximately, 1400 BC to 1000 BC. That's not exactly right, but yeah. Yeah, Phil. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. God uses imperfect people that he eventually accomplishes his ends. And that's a good way to say it's hard. It's hard to know. Like, okay, what does it mean that the Spirit of the Lord came on him? Like, it doesn't mean that, he was mad and blood rushed to his head. Well, obviously, we think it's more than that. Is it perhaps a euphemism to say that here's what the Bible describes Samson as? It says that he raised Samson up because he wanted to take vengeance on the Philistines. So there's this overarching goal that God has, ultimately defeating the Philistines. That doesn't mean that he endorses Samson's way of doing it, but that the ultimate end of God ridding Israel of its enemies can be done in multiple ways. So it wouldn't make sense to say Samson killed those men in his own strength, because he couldn't. So did God give him the strength to kill him? Yes. Was that meaning that God was endorsing Samson's vengeance? No. And again, I think it's so important for us to look back in God's original design. God's original design wasn't for there to be enemies to be killed. But in a world where that happens, God uses means at times that are, quote unquote, or that are sinful in terms of what the human is trying to do, but God uses them for his own devices. Yeah, like. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so the last thing that it says is every man does what's right in his own eyes, and there was no king. At which point you start to see why the people of Israel eventually say, well, maybe we should do away with this judges model and maybe we should put a king model in instead. So they do. Then the question is, well, how does that work out? You know what I mean? Right, and Samuel tells them not to, and here's the point. God was always meant to be the judge. God was always meant to be the king. The design was never for Israel to have a human king because God was their king. But when people start to long for things that God never intended, again, that's when things go bad. And so, but that's a good point. It's not saying that anything that happens in Judges is ideal, but it is saying that it exposed how bad it can, like the kingship of Israel was not good, except for maybe a couple of tiny highlights. But it was better at least than the Judges. You know what I mean? It's almost like God says, okay, anything that I'm not intimately involved in is not going to work, but there are bad ideas and there are worse ideas. The Judges' idea, when people do what's right in their own eyes, is worse than the kingship idea. At least, again, why? Because the people weren't following the law. If the people had followed the law, the Judges' idea would have worked fine. But they didn't. Why? Because they assimilated, right, with all the nations around them. They worshiped foreign gods. If they would have followed the law, they would have never needed a king. But they didn't. And they didn't accept God as their king. And again, it's all leading to the ultimate king, the ultimate judge who fulfills all of these offices. Okay, we're out of time. I'd love to stick around if anyone wants to talk, but thank you so much for being here tonight. Next time we'll hit probably 1 and 2 Samuel all in one swoop. So we'll do that next week.